I didn't think a road could start a war over land rights until I saw a subdivision treating my property like it belonged to them. My name is Ethan Cole, and I learned that ownership means nothing to people who believe access is a habit instead of a permission. I had just closed on 7,200 acres of undeveloped land outside Willowbrook Reserve 3 days earlier, and I still hadn't fully processed what that kind of space actually meant. The first time I drove the perimeter, the gravel road stretched farther than I could see, cutting through dry fields and low hills that rolled like waves under a pale Texas sky. At the center of that land sat a narrow access corridor, a single road that connected the Willowbrook Reserve subdivision to the main county highway. According to the deed, that corridor was not theirs to control, not theirs to expand, and not theirs to assume was public just because it had always been used that way. I noticed the first signs of tension when I saw tire tracks crossing deeper into my property than any survey map had ever authorized. No gates, no permission requests, just a quiet assumption that my land was an extension of their neighborhood. That was the moment I started checking everything twice, because assumptions are expensive when property lines are involved. I pulled county records, satellite overlays, and every survey document tied to the acquisition, looking for anything that might explain why people felt entitled to cross land they didn't own. The deeper I went, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about a road. It was about a long-standing misunderstanding that had never been corrected. And somewhere in that quiet realization, I understood I wasn't dealing with confusion, I was dealing with expectation. The HOA of Willowbrook Reserve had operated for years on a simple belief that convenience eventually becomes entitlement if nobody pushes back. They maintained landscaping rules, community signage, and patrol schedules, but none of those things ever included legal ownership of the access corridor they depended on. I drove past their entrance one evening, noticing how their security cameras were angled not just at the street, but slightly into my land. It wasn't aggressive at first glance, but it was deliberate enough to make me stop the truck and sit there with the engine idling. I remember thinking how often people confuse visibility with authority, as if seeing something makes it theirs. But ownership doesn't care about perception, it only responds to documentation. I didn't speak to anyone that night. I just went back through the paperwork again, line by line, until the map started to tell a different story than the one they were living in. And that's when I saw it, something everyone else had missed for years. A single access point, recorded in a legacy survey, never formally transferred, never legally expanded, sitting quietly inside my newly acquired boundary. It was the kind of detail that only matters when someone finally decides to read the fine print instead of the assumptions built around it. So I stopped assuming and started preparing. The kind of preparation that doesn't involve confrontation, only clarity. Because in my experience, clarity is what changes everything when people have been comfortable being wrong for too long. And Willowbrook Reserve, whether they knew it or not, had been wrong for a very long time. I could already see how this would end, not with noise, but with paperwork, boundaries, and a simple correction of what had been ignored. All I needed was time, documentation, and a quiet understanding of where everything legally stood now. I noticed the first real sign that Willowbrook Reserve was not just using the land near my boundary, they were relying on it. It started early one morning when I was reviewing the updated survey markers along the eastern edge of my property. The air was still, dry, and carried that faint smell of dust that comes right before sunrise in rural Texas. As I drove slowly along the perimeter road in my pickup truck, I saw something that did not match any of the legal maps I had reviewed the night before. A maintenance truck from the HOA was parked just beyond the tree line, partially on my side of the boundary. 2 workers were installing a small directional sign pointing toward the subdivision entrance, and the signpost had been driven directly into soil that, according to every official record I held, belonged to me. I stayed in the truck for a moment, watching them work with the calm confidence of people who had done this before without interruption. There was no hesitation in their movements, no awareness that anything about their presence might be questionable. It was not aggression, it was assumption. An assumption is always more dangerous than intent because it spreads quietly and feels justified. I stepped out of the truck and walked closer, not raising my voice, not rushing, just observing. One of the workers looked at me briefly but continued tightening bolts on the sign as if my presence was irrelevant. That was when I understood the deeper issue. This was not an isolated mistake. It was a system operating under a shared belief that the boundary line did not apply to them. Later that afternoon, I drove to the Willowbrook Reserve entrance to study how the entire corridor functioned. The gatehouse sat clean and polished, with security cameras positioned at angles that captured both incoming traffic and a portion of my land beyond the fence line. Residents moved through the entrance without stopping for more than a few seconds, scanning access cards or automatic pass systems that clearly assumed uninterrupted passage. I parked across the road and observed for nearly an hour, watching how casually the flow of traffic depended on what they believed was a public right-of-way. No one stopped to question where the land actually ended. No one slowed down long enough to consider ownership. It struck me then how deeply convenience can disguise itself as legality when it is repeated often enough. That evening, I returned to my office and laid out every document again, spreading deed records, county plats, and survey maps across the table. I traced the access corridor with my finger, comparing each version of the property description, searching for consistency or contradiction. The more I examined it, the clearer it became that the subdivision had been operating under an informal understanding for years, one that had never been legally confirmed. Somewhere in the past, someone had treated access as permanent instead of conditional, and that assumption had been passed down like tradition rather than law. I highlighted the specific language in the deed that confirmed my authority over access permissions, then cross-referenced it with the county infrastructure records. Everything aligned in a way that left no ambiguity. The corridor was not public, not shared, and not open by default. It existed under a single condition, and that condition had always been the discretion of the landowner. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the quiet hum of the room, thinking about how often disputes are not born from conflict, but from people forgetting to ask the right question at the right time. The problem was no longer about what they believed. It was about what the documents actually said, and what would happen when those documents were finally enforced without exception. I did not expect silence to last long once paperwork met habit, because people who operate on assumptions rarely stop when they are corrected. 2 days after I finished reviewing the access records again, I noticed movement along the corridor that confirmed what I had already begun to suspect. A white utility SUV with Willowbrook Reserve markings rolled slowly along the access road, stopping near the midpoint of the corridor where my property line narrowed into a natural bend. I watched from a distance, engine off, parked behind a stand of mesquite trees, as two individuals stepped out with clipboards and began marking points along the ground. They were not surveying for accuracy, they were documenting for confirmation, as if the land itself had already been approved for their use. That distinction mattered more than anything else. Approval versus permission is where most property disputes begin without anyone realizing it. I waited until they finished their measurements and drove away before I approached the area on foot. The soil was dry under my boots, marked with small flags they had placed in neat intervals, each one signaling intent rather than authority. I removed none of them. Instead, I photographed every marker, every angle, every trace of their activity, because documentation is only powerful when it is complete. Later that evening, I received the first formal notice. It arrived by certified mail, delivered to my temporary office in town. The envelope carried the official seal of Willowbrook Reserve Homeowners Association, and inside was a carefully worded document stating that I was obstructing community access and interfering with established infrastructure. There were references to long-standing usage, implied agreements, and community reliance, but not a single attached legal instrument that confirmed any of it. I laid the letter on the table and read it twice, not because it was complicated, but because it revealed exactly how far their assumptions had already progressed. They were not asking for clarification. They were asserting continuity as if repetition had legal weight. That same afternoon, I drove into Willowbrook Reserve and parked across from their administrative office. The building was modest, designed to look neutral rather than imposing, but the activity inside told a different story. People moved with purpose, printing documents, making calls, preparing notices. I sat in the truck long enough to observe the rhythm of their process. Every action pointed outward, toward enforcement, never inward toward verification. When I finally stepped inside, the air was cool and carried the faint smell of paper and polished wood. A receptionist greeted me with practiced politeness, and within minutes I was sitting across from the HOA manager, a woman named Margaret Holloway. She did not look surprised to see me, which told me everything I needed to know about how they had framed the situation internally. She spoke first, referencing community continuity, historical use, and the inconvenience of disruption. Her tone was calm, almost procedural, as if the matter had already been categorized before I arrived. I listened without interrupting, letting each phrase settle in its own space. When she finished, I placed my folder on the table and opened it slowly. Inside were the deed records, the survey maps, and the county filings that defined the access corridor in precise legal terms. I did not raise my voice or emphasize anything. I simply aligned their claims against the documented record. The room grew quieter as she reviewed the pages, her expression shifting in subtle stages from confidence to calculation. What mattered was not confrontation, but alignment with reality. And in that moment, the gap between those two things became impossible to ignore. I left the office without further discussion, but I could feel the shift behind me, the moment when certainty begins to weaken under the weight of verified information. The next step was no longer about convincing anyone. It was about what would happen when belief collided with boundaries that could no longer be reinterpreted. I did not expect the situation to escalate through procedure rather than confrontation, but that is exactly what began to happen once official notices entered the system. 3 days after my meeting at the Willowbrook Reserve office, I started receiving copies of internal correspondence that were clearly meant to formalize their position rather than question it. Each document referenced the access corridor as if its status was already settled, using language like established usage, community reliance, and uninterrupted historical passage. None of those phrases carried legal weight on their own, but together they formed a narrative strong enough to influence perception if no one challenged it. I laid each page out on my desk in chronological order, tracing how quickly assumption had been converted into administrative routine. What stood out most was not what they were claiming, but how confidently they were building processes around something they had never verified. That kind of momentum is difficult to stop once it starts because systems tend to reinforce themselves before they validate their foundation. Meanwhile, activity along the corridor increased. I began noticing daily movement patterns that suggested coordination rather than coincidence. At approximately 8 in the morning, vehicles from Willowbrook Reserve would pass through the access road in steady intervals, followed later in the afternoon by maintenance crews performing minor adjustments to signage and landscaping near the entry point. None of this involved consultation, notification, or acknowledgment of my ownership. It was as if the physical presence of infrastructure had become justification for continued use, regardless of legal origin. I drove the entire perimeter again one morning, stopping at 3 separate points where equipment had been placed just beyond my boundary line. Each installation was subtle, low fencing, directional markers, and small utility fixtures, but together they formed an implied extension of their controlled environment into my land. I took photographs at every stop, not because I expected immediate resolution, but because patterns only become undeniable when they are preserved in sequence. That afternoon, I received another letter, this time more direct. It stated that my interference with community access could result in formal escalation, including potential claims regarding obstruction of established ingress routes. The language was carefully constructed, avoiding direct assertion of ownership, while still implying that my rights were secondary to long-standing usage. I remember reading it twice, not because it surprised me, but because it confirmed the direction they had chosen. They were no longer testing boundaries. They were attempting to redefine them through repetition and documentation. Later that week, I requested a formal title review through an independent surveyor licensed in the state. I did not inform the HOA in advance. Instead, I focused on ensuring every measurement, every coordinate, and every historical record was verified without influence. When the preliminary findings came back, they aligned exactly with what I had already identified in the deed records. The access corridor existed entirely within my parcel boundary, and no recorded easement granted permanent rights of passage to any external entity. The implication of that finding was not immediately disruptive, but it was structurally decisive. I spent that evening reviewing the survey data alongside county infrastructure maps, noting how discrepancies between informal use and legal documentation had persisted for years without correction. It became clear that the system they were operating under was not built on ownership, but on continuity of behavior. And continuity, once established, often replaces verification unless deliberately interrupted. I closed the folder and looked out across the darkened land beyond my window, thinking about how many systems in general function the same way, not through certainty, but through repetition that no one stops to question. The next step would not involve debate or persuasion. It would involve alignment, because once documentation and reality are placed side by side, one of them always has to give way. I noticed the shift before it ever became official, because in situations like this, change does not arrive in one moment, it arrives in patterns. Vehicles from Willowbrook Reserve began slowing at the access point longer than usual, sometimes pausing at the edge of my property as if waiting for something that no longer existed. At first, I thought it was confusion, the kind that happens when people are used to operating without interruption. But by the fourth morning of observation, it was clear they were not confused. They were testing consistency, trying to see if absence of response meant permission had returned. I remained in my truck parked half a mile down the service road, watching through the dust-covered windshield as the rhythm of entry attempts continued. Each vehicle that approached would slow, pause, then proceed as if nothing had changed. It was not defiance yet, but it was close enough to require attention. That same day, I received a notice labeled as an urgent community infrastructure concern. It stated that immediate access was required for maintenance coordination and emergency response reliability. The phrasing was carefully chosen, designed to elevate routine access into something that sounded essential rather than optional. I placed the document beside the others on my desk and noticed how quickly their language had evolved from assumption to justification. What began as historical use had now become operational necessity in their narrative. I contacted the surveyor again and requested a full boundary certification report with timestamped field verification. While waiting for the finalized document, I revisited the original county filings line by line. There was a particular section buried deep in the property record that confirmed what I had already begun to rely on internally, that access was never permanent, never guaranteed, and always contingent upon the discretion of the landowner. That clause had not changed, but its relevance had been ignored for years because no one had ever enforced it. 2 days later, the surveyor arrived on site with equipment and a small team to conduct a final verification sweep. I stayed nearby, but did not interfere, observing as they placed markers along the exact legal boundary lines. The process was slow, deliberate, and precise, and with each marker placed, the abstract lines on paper became physical reality on the ground. By midday, the lead surveyor confirmed what the documentation had already indicated. The access corridor that Willowbrook Reserve had been using was fully contained within my parcel designation, with no recorded easement granting perpetual access rights. The confirmation was not dramatic, but it carried weight in the way professionals recognize finality when it appears in their fieldwork. I remember standing there as the surveyor packed up equipment, looking across land that had been treated as shared space for years without ever being legally defined that way. That evening, I returned home and reviewed the finalized report again, paying close attention to the language used in the certification. It was precise, unemotional, and absolute in its conclusion. The boundary was not open to interpretation. It was fixed. I then prepared a formal notice based entirely on verified documentation, ensuring that every statement could be traced back to either the deed, the survey, or the county record. There was no need for additional commentary or explanation beyond what the documents already established. As I sealed the envelope, I thought about how often disputes like this are not resolved through argument, but through the moment when one version of reality is replaced by another that cannot be ignored. The next time Willowbrook Reserve attempted to treat the corridor as continuous access, they would not be encountering resistance. They would be encountering the limits of what the land actually permitted, as defined not by habit, but by record. I delivered the formal notice early the next morning, not in person, but through certified channels that ensured it would be recorded, timestamped, and acknowledged under county procedure. It was not emotional in any way. It simply restated the survey certification, the deed language, and the legal boundary conditions that defined access as revocable at the discretion of the landowner. By midday, I already had confirmation of delivery. By evening, I received the response I expected. It came from Willowbrook Reserve Legal Counsel, structured in careful language that referenced community reliance, historical usage patterns, and potential injunctive relief to prevent disruption of what they called essential access continuity. I read every line slowly, noticing how the tone had shifted from assumption to pressure, as if repetition could eventually override documentation. There was no legal instrument attached that challenged ownership, only assertion framed as concern. The distinction mattered more than anything else. The next morning, I arrived at the access corridor before sunrise. The air was still and cool, and the ground held the faint dampness from overnight humidity. I had already arranged for temporary infrastructure installation to ensure the boundary was physically consistent with the legal record. A reinforced gate structure had been placed exactly on the surveyed line, with visible signage referencing private property and access authorization requirements. Nothing about it was aggressive. It was precise, deliberate, and fully aligned with the documentation that had already been certified. By 7 in the morning, the first Willowbrook Reserve vehicle arrived at the corridor entrance. It slowed as usual, but this time it stopped completely. I watched from a distance as the driver stepped out and examined the gate, then looked back toward the subdivision entrance as if waiting for something to change. Nothing changed. Within minutes, a second vehicle arrived, then a third, forming a small line along the access point that had previously been treated as continuous passage. The atmosphere shifted from routine to uncertain, not because of confrontation, but because expectation no longer matched physical reality. Shortly after, a representative from the HOA arrived alongside a local law enforcement officer acting in a civil standby capacity. I approached slowly, carrying a copy of the survey certification, the deed extract, and the county verification report. The officer reviewed the documents first, taking time to compare the boundary coordinates with the physical placement of the gate. There was no debate in his expression, only confirmation. He asked a few procedural questions, all of which were answered directly through the paperwork. The HOA representative attempted to reference prior usage and community necessity, but each point was met with the same response. There was no recorded easement. There was no granted access agreement. There was only conditional permission tied to ownership discretion. After several minutes, the officer stepped back and confirmed that, from a procedural standpoint, the matter was civil and governed by property documentation already provided. The vehicles remained where they were, but no further action was taken. The silence that followed was different from uncertainty. It was the sound of systems recalibrating after encountering a boundary that could not be negotiated through assumption. Later that afternoon, I received a call from Willowbrook Reserve Management requesting clarification on whether access could be temporarily restored pending legal review. I declined without additional commentary, referring only to the established documentation and the certified notice already in effect. By sunset, the corridor was quiet. No movement, no maintenance activity, no administrative presence. Just an open stretch of land defined by coordinates that had always existed, now finally being acknowledged in practice. I stood near the gate as the light faded, looking across the boundary that had once been treated as invisible. What changed was not the land itself, but the recognition that access without permission is not continuity. It is simply temporary tolerance, and tolerance ends the moment documentation is enforced without exception. I did not expect the silence around the access corridor to last more than a day, because systems that rely on habit usually react quickly when that habit is interrupted. By the next morning, I could already see the first signs that Willowbrook Reserve was shifting from assumption to escalation. 2 vehicles arrived near the boundary line within the first hour of sunrise, but instead of stopping at the gate, they remained parked at a distance as if waiting for instruction that no longer matched the current reality. I stayed inside my truck on the opposite ridge, watching through the early light as the situation began to reorganize itself around the new boundary conditions. Around mid-morning, I received notice that the Homeowners Association had filed for an emergency injunction requesting temporary restoration of access. The language was urgent, framed around community safety, emergency response requirements, and disruption of essential infrastructure flow, but none of it referenced any legal easement or recorded right. It was the same pattern I had seen before, where necessity was used as a substitute for documentation. I forwarded the filing directly to the county recorder and requested immediate verification against the certified survey. By early afternoon, I received confirmation that the court would not grant temporary relief without clear evidence of a recorded access agreement, which did not exist in any filed document. That single procedural response changed the tone of everything that followed. Later that day, I was contacted by the HOA legal representative again, but this time the conversation was noticeably different. The confidence had been replaced with careful phrasing, and the demands had shifted into requests for clarification rather than enforcement. I listened without interruption as they attempted to revisit historical use, community reliance, and prior maintenance contributions, but each point circled back to the same unresolved issue. Usage does not establish ownership, and repetition does not create legal standing. After the call ended, I drove back toward the corridor and observed a meeting forming near the subdivision entrance. Several residents had gathered alongside HOA board members, and the atmosphere suggested uncertainty rather than coordination. No one approached the gate. No one attempted to cross the boundary. Instead, they remained clustered near the entrance, speaking in low tones and occasionally pointing toward the access road as if it had become unfamiliar overnight. I remained at a distance, not intervening, simply observing how quickly certainty can dissolve when it is no longer supported by routine. By the following morning, a second formal response arrived, this time acknowledging the survey certification but requesting negotiation for a limited access agreement. The tone had shifted again, now framed around compromise and mutual benefit. I reviewed the document carefully and noted that for the first time, they were no longer asserting entitlement, only attempting to reintroduce access through agreement. I declined the request in writing, referencing only the recorded boundary conditions and the absence of any legal easement. There was no added commentary, no justification, only alignment with the certified record. That evening, I received a final call from their legal counsel, who explained that the Homeowners Association was considering structural adjustments to their internal planning in response to the confirmed boundary. The phrasing was cautious, but the meaning was clear. They were no longer trying to challenge ownership. They were adjusting expectations to match it. I ended the call and walked outside into the quiet air near the gate, where the land remained unchanged but the perception around it had shifted completely. The access corridor stood empty, not because it had been taken away, but because its status had finally been recognized as conditional rather than assumed. And in that recognition, the entire system that had depended on habit alone began to settle into something far more precise, where only documented rights determined what remained possible. I arrived at the access corridor just after sunrise and immediately noticed that the environment no longer felt like a disputed space, but like a system in transition. The gate remained in place, exactly where I had authorized its installation, but there were subtle signs that Willowbrook Reserve was adjusting to its presence. A vehicle sat parked near the subdivision side of the boundary, engine running, as if the driver was waiting for something to change through passage of time alone. I stayed in my truck at a distance, watching without movement, because observation tells you more than engagement ever will in moments like this. Around 20 minutes later, a second vehicle arrived, then another, forming a small cluster just short of the gate. No one attempted to cross. No one stepped out with urgency or authority. Instead, there was hesitation, and hesitation is the first measurable sign that assumption has been replaced by awareness. Shortly after, I received notification that Willowbrook Reserve had formally withdrawn their request for emergency injunctive relief. The document was brief, almost procedural in tone, stating that further legal review was underway and that no immediate action would be pursued pending clarification of property boundaries. I read it twice, not because it was complex, but because it marked a shift in how they were choosing to operate. They were no longer trying to override documentation, only interpret it in a way that preserved access without direct conflict. That distinction mattered. By mid-morning, I observed a representative from the HOA speaking with several residents near the entrance. Their posture was different now, less confident, more procedural. Maps were being unfolded, then folded again, as if the act of reviewing them repeatedly might reveal something that had been missed. I remained at a distance, watching how quickly structured certainty dissolves when it encounters verified limits. Around noon, I received a formal request for a mediated boundary discussion, this time acknowledging my ownership of the corridor but proposing a conditional access agreement based on emergency response and community continuity needs. The tone was no longer assertive. It was adaptive. I reviewed the request carefully, noting that every argument now depended on cooperation rather than entitlement. I responded with a single written statement confirming that any access beyond the recorded boundary would require explicit authorization under the deed terms and could not be presumed under historical use. There was no emotion in the response, only alignment with the documented record. Later that afternoon, I drove the perimeter once more and observed that the corridor remained clear, with no vehicles attempting entry. The space that had once been treated as an extension of the subdivision now functioned strictly within its legal limits. Even the signage near the entrance had been adjusted, with temporary notices removed and replaced by neutral directional markers that no longer implied authority over my land. It was a quiet change, but a significant one, because it reflected acknowledgment rather than resistance. I parked near the ridge overlooking the entire access line and watched as the sun moved lower across the open fields. There was no further movement from the HOA side, only stillness where repeated assumption had once created constant activity. The situation had not escalated into conflict because it did not need to. It resolved itself through documentation, timing, and the absence of ambiguity. What remained was clarity, and clarity, once established, does not require reinforcement. It simply stands. I returned to the access corridor one final time at the end of the week, not because anything required my presence, but because I wanted to confirm that the system had fully settled into its new state. The morning was quiet, with a light wind moving across the open land and carrying the faint sound of distant traffic from the county road. The gate remained exactly where it had been installed, unchanged and undisturbed. On the subdivision side, I could see movement, but it was no longer directed toward the boundary itself. Vehicles passed through the internal streets of Willowbrook Reserve without slowing, and the earlier pattern of hesitation at the access point had completely disappeared. It was as if the entire network had accepted a new operational reality without further resistance. I parked near the ridge and observed for nearly an hour, noting how behavior had shifted from inquiry to compliance. There were no further attempts to treat the corridor as shared infrastructure. No one stopped at the gate. No one questioned its placement. The assumption that had once driven repeated access had been replaced by procedural avoidance. Later that morning, I received the final correspondence from Willowbrook Reserve Homeowners Association. It was not framed as a challenge or a request. It was a formal acknowledgment of boundary clarification, confirming that access through the corridor would henceforth require explicit authorization consistent with recorded property rights. The language was careful, precise, and notably free of implication. I read it once, then set it aside, because there was nothing left to interpret. The record had already spoken more clearly than any additional discussion could achieve. By midday, I conducted one last walkthrough of the boundary line, moving slowly along the edge where the survey markers had been placed earlier in the process. The land itself had not changed, but the way it was being treated had fundamentally shifted. What once operated as assumed passage now functioned strictly as defined territory, with no overlap between expectation and legal structure. I stopped at the midpoint of the corridor and looked across toward the subdivision entrance. There were no vehicles waiting, no personnel monitoring the gate, and no visible signs of administrative presence. The absence of activity was not empty. It was resolved. I thought back through the entire sequence, from the first tire tracks crossing the boundary to the final acknowledgment letter, and the pattern became clear. The conflict had never been about force or confrontation. It had been about whether documentation would eventually outweigh habit. And once it did, everything else adjusted around it naturally. I had not needed to escalate anything beyond verification. The certified survey, the deed language, and the county record had all aligned in a way that left no interpretive space for continued assumption. As the afternoon light began to soften across the fields, I made my way back toward the truck and paused before starting the engine. There was a sense of closure, not because anything had been taken, but because nothing had to be defended anymore. The boundary stood on its own now, defined and recognized, requiring no further explanation or reinforcement. I drove slowly along the perimeter road one last time, passing the gate without stopping. On the other side, Willowbrook Reserve continued its daily rhythm, but it no longer extended into my land by assumption or expectation. What had changed was not the geography, but the recognition of it. And in that recognition, the entire situation settled into something stable, where ownership and access were no longer competing ideas, but clearly separated realities governed only by record.